right. Last time we looked at case 1, isolated compound patterns. And case 1 was first you went through one aspect and then you went through the other. In fact, you could call them that kind of destiny. One thing and then another. In any aspect pattern, when any of the planets is activated, the whole pattern is activated as a whole. That's if you're looking at the activity being only where the planets are. It is what we're talking about when we say one thing and then another. That's when something is going through the interval between one planet and another. And the interval influences are not as strong usually as when the planets themselves are being triggered off. It would have been nice if I could have found one, but I have yet to find one where there is an isolated aspect pattern where the two intervals have nothing else in between them except the planets that bound them on either end. And so, but it's just so hard to find these examples. Now, what we did seem to find last time was that the squares were stronger than the sextiles. And that could have been just because of the people we took. It could be for a number of reasons. It takes a lot more observation than what we're doing in the class when we're just doing a very few hand-picked examples. To do a statistical study or an observational study would take many, many more. It might be that we, as the observers, might even be more sensitive to squares than we are to sextiles. The news media certainly is. You turn on the news and you hear much more square news than you hear sextile news. And that's so that you can see that it works out that way. Now, if it is true that the squares are stronger than the sextiles, apart from the orbs and things like that, it is probably because any planet who is traversing the pattern is going to spend more time in the interval that is the square than is in the sextile. And so that is something that we want to look at when next time we meet. We'll be talking about case 3. And in that case, it'll be a square and a trine, and more time will have been spent going through the trine than through the square, and then we should be able to see whether that thesis is true or not, except for the fact that trines are usually not as intense as squares, but that's it. So now we're going to look tonight at case 2 examples. And you might say if the case 1 was one thing and then another, the case 2 examples are one thing and another, in that there is a sharing of 2/3 of the interval, so that 2/3 of the time a planet is being affected by boundings from both the square and from the sextile. There's the activation on the planets remains the same, except the hinges are different. The hinge in a case 1 is between the two aspects, and in a case 2, the hinge is either at the beginning or at the terminal, at the other end, depending on whether it is a C1 or C2 example. I hope you have your handouts that I gave you last time and that I gave you a few weeks ago. It says all of these unkind things, so pussy, and all right. The degree sequences work the same in all 4 cases. We're ready to start looking at some horoscopes of case 2. All right. Oh, let's see here. What we're looking at in this case, the case 2 is the lead planet, Mercury. This is a C1 Venus, and the terminal planet is the Moon. So we're looking at a sextile inside of a square, sharing some of the same things. So what happens is that Mercury kicks things off. It's a mental activity, and then somewhere along the line, Venus kicks in with a lot of love and emotion, and then the determination of who is stronger, the square, or if there's an issue, two issues resting on this pattern, when in the moon is the deciding time. The degree sequences are the same as the interval sequences. Like anything going around will go this way, so Mercury leads it off. But when you look at the degree sequences, Mercury is also the lowest degree at 24, Venus at 26, and then the moon at 27. So this should be a fairly clear-cut pattern. By orbs, the sextile between the moon and Venus is a little bit stronger than the square because there's a smaller orb. Hi, Bonnie. You braved it. Wow. The moon is the hinge planet. And so it's the ultimate for both the intervals and for the degree sequences. Now, the 10th house is usually the house of relations with the mother. And the moon is usually the planet, given everything else, the moon is usually the planet that indicates the mother also. And so, in this case, since the moon is in the 10th house, this means that the mother is an exceedingly strong influence. And this proved to be true. The mother encouraged her in her career and helped her all the way through. It was a much stronger mother-daughter relationship than normal. Now, this is not quite a perfect isolation in this, because there is some sort of a fringe of Mars square Mercury. Mercury's pulling away from it, so you might say that this is more integrated. And there's also a little bit of Moon square Saturn. So it's not perfect isolation, but the effect certainly is there. We can call it a quasi-isolated pattern. And we can see that this is all about femininity. It's all about the feminine in her life because the moon is so strong and so pointed in this. Now, if you look at her movies, she always takes very, very feminine female roles. And this is impressive. It shows a use of the Aries influence that one doesn't often find. Usually, with the Sun in Aries, or even with Venus in Aries, there's sometimes a tomboy effect. But this is individual to her, because if you look at it, the Sun is in a grand trine with Neptune and with Mars in fire signs, and Venus is in a fire sign, and so you would expect that the fire signs tend to be more masculine and not just Aries alone. And on top of that, Jupiter's opposite the Sun, so you would expect some kind of exaggerated masculinity. But that isn't there because she was really famous for being a woman. Now, she used to be referred to as America's favorite virgin because she had this virgin innocence in all of her movies. Now, you might think that that was due to having Virgo rising, but I don't believe that. I think it has to do with the Venus in Aries. Because if you take a forceful action, if you're swinging a baseball bat or a golf club or something like that, you say that you take a good, clean swipe at things. And I think that there is a kind of purity that it comes from fire that burns out any kind of impurity within it, and I think she had some of that in her. So the pattern begins with with Mercury square the moon, and Mercury conjoins the 7th house cusp, and it's a double-bodied sign on the cusp, and she had 4 marriages, and she chose not always such good men to be married to. I think what she was looking, the father had abandoned the family, and she was looking in the wrong places for men. 2 of the men, the first 2 marriages that were to musicians, and the first one, her husband used to beat her. So you can see that there is some kind of bad choices or bad thinking about partners. Sort of like her emotions and her mind cause like a rippling kind of thing. There's not a peacefulness here. And very often the emotions run away with the mind, and the moon is stronger than Mercury in this case, and so her emotions do take over. It's probably carelessness, and she was gullible. You know, it's just a young woman straight out of high school. She was famous. The moon and Venus, which are the internal sextile, are the 2 most feminine planets. So it's not surprising that she has all of this femininity. And they are both cohesive planets. Both of them hold things together. So that's why they're both planets of imagination. There's only one fixed planet in the horoscope, and that's Neptune, and Neptune is not really considered something that holds things together. So she finds in her femininity the ability to keep things together and not let things run away. She found that coherency in love, but it didn't always turn out to be love of human beings because men treated her so badly. Her last marriage was to a man who together with his business partner squandered away most of her millions. But the business partner still had a lot of money yet, and she eventually sued and sued and sued. You can see there's a lot of lawsuit activity in this. And she won back quite a bit of it, but not all of it, and the man couldn't pay it all back, so she won a case, but not necessarily the money. So what we're seeing then is that she can stick by the mistakes that she makes. And even when emotions get away with her mind, if she relies on her femininity, she can live by it, and it works very well for her. In fact, that's what she does now. Because only when she's still alive. She has an estate, and she's never seen in public, rarely, very rarely. And she lives with many, many cats and dogs. And she has all women there to help her with her household affairs, her business affairs, and everything else. And it turns out that she chose to live the women over the men. All right.
Question.
Yes.
You said grand trine, but how is Neptune isn't in that?
Yes, it is. Mars, trine Neptune, trine Sun.
But it's not trine the sun, though.
Sure it is.
13 and 23?
13 degrees. The darker letters are the degrees. Neptune's at 13.
Oh,
The Sun is at 13.
I thought it was 23 there.
Yeah, no, they shift from inside to outside. See, by the 8th house, it had already shifted outside. For the degree, you look at the darker numbers on there. All right?
The types of movies that she made irked feminists because she was often either hysterical or being spanked by Rock Hudson and being subjugated, or
Yeah.
was that part of her?
Yeah, that's part of what I was trying to get at. That she's not a typical Sun in Aries or Venus in Aries at all.
She had real tomboy hairdos, though.
Sounds like an indulgent night tonight.
But then there was and that's such his name for the best.
This is somebody everybody knows, I'm sure. This is Fritjof Capra. And I must say that I might be biased in looking at this horoscope because it goes on one of my pet peeves. Fritjof Capra is a theoretical physicist. He's a high-energy theoretical physicist. He's also the author of a book called The Tao of Physics, a book which tries to show the similarities between modern physics as it stands today and ancient Oriental mysticism. He has one statement that he's famous about, with which most people agree. It is that science does not need mysticism, and mysticism does not need science, but man needs both. Now, if you take, there's three different parts to that. Science does not need mysticism. I disagree with that. Most of the world would not disagree, but I think they need mysticism because the world outlook that they have cannot come up with any really important answers for humanity, and it's not to their best. Mysticism does not need science. I'm with him 100%. What happens is, this is where my pet peeve comes in. New Agey types of people who are sort of lightweights always look to science to prove their beliefs. And they don't understand science, and they're not scientists, and the scientists are outraged. The scientific community, almost to every individual within them, does not like Fritjof Capra because of the things he said. Now, this is the isolated pattern we're looking at is the Sun as the lead planet by interval is sextile to Saturn, and it is square to Uranus. By degree sequence, it's the same way again. The lowest degree is the Sun, and the highest degree is Uranus. So we again have a very strongly supported and clear pattern. The hinge planet in this case turns out to be Uranus, which is in both the sextile and the square. Now, this describes his life. He was an excellent, when he did experimental work, he was an excellent experimentalist. And it is when he speculates on the meaning of it, he tries to jump from something that is not within his knowledge. Now, he says science is guilty of working with small pieces and then building big theories out of them. And he thinks it should be the other way around, that you should have the big picture first and then the details fit into it, which is a very mystical way of looking at things, and I believe he's right in that. But he doesn't have the big picture, and he does exactly the same thing. He takes the stuff of science and then he jumps. He takes intuitive leaps to his ideas about physics, and so he's doing the same thing that he's saying that science shouldn't be doing. He says it should work the other way around. So if we look at this, this is actually a double. This is a case 2 with C1 and C2, because Jupiter actually sextiles Uranus also. And so you have both C1 and C2 occupied. But this shows a better viewing the big picture and it shows a better viewing of speculation. Because as a scientific speculator, he does quite well. It's just that when he gets beyond the science, that he goes gaflooey. He had long conversations with Heisenberg about the implications of quantum mechanics and what could be drawn from it. Heisenberg wasn't quite as daring as he was and continues to be. Now, he has a really good big picture when it comes to other things. Like he writes on ecology, and he's excellent in putting together all kinds of facts about what can and what should be done ecologically to save us and the planet. I think that's excellent. But he tries to synthesize all of the sciences together, and he tries to get to what would be called a kind of total knowledge. And he doesn't have the consciousness to get to total knowledge, again, because he doesn't have that top-down view of things. Now the interesting thing of this is that it's related to something else in the horoscope. Mercury is opposite to Pluto. And Mercury opposite Pluto means that he gets mind-boggled. And so this is what happens to him. He gets mind-boggled, and he jumps to, I guess, speculative conclusions that are not necessarily founded. And when he wrote the famous book, The Tao of Physics, he said he was unable to do what he needed to do, but he got great upliftment and great strength from what he called power plants. Plants. I think he took hallucinogenic mushrooms or LSD or something like that. And nonetheless, even in his errors, I believe he's a benefit to society. He just does a lot of things that irk me personally, but who am I? I'm on Lakeside and he's in the world. He's got the world.
What about his the third part of this statement? But man needs both.
At this point, we do, because our way forward, we have to follow the poet William Blake says, if a man persists in his folly, he will become wise, and we can't just drop science. We have to go through science and in it come to something that we can surrender to a higher kind of consciousness, and in that surrender have a much bigger picture of things. This is a horoscope we've looked at before. Part of the Kennedy clan, Maria Shriver, the Terminator of the Terminator. I think I think I ran into a number somewhere of the multi-million dollars that it's going to be in their divorce. I don't even know if it's completely settled or not yet. And on top of that, it started to come out that she was mousing around as well as him, and it could, things get so ugly and messy. All right, this horoscope is a study in complexity, a very enormous complexity, and there are two semi-isolated compounds, case 1 and case 2. Every planet in this horoscope is in a case 2 compound, though not all are isolated. The moon is the hinge planet, and the moon sextiles Mars. The moon squares the sun, which is the real reason I wanted to look at this, is for that moon square sun. If you look then, Pluto conjoins Jupiter, and they are sextile to Neptune, and they are square to Saturn, which is another internal, the only planet that isn't involved in much of this is Venus, which is sort of in a square to Jupiter. All right, and if there's a trapezoid here. The moon is in a square to over here. Venus is in a square here. And there's a trine between Uranus and Venus. So it's a trapezoid, a very complex trapezoid that I don't know if I want to go into. What we're looking at is, even though the sun is the terminal planet when you're going by the sweep through the zodiac, it is the lead planet in the degree sequence, because the sun is at 3, Venus is at 4, the sun is at 13, Venus is at, the moon is at 14, and Mars is at 15. So by degree sequence, it goes Sun, Moon, Mars, and by interval sequence, it goes Moon, Mars, Sun. So Moon is the initial planet, and the square is with the Sun, and it's very, very complex, and there's many possible interpretations of this. Now, this is very different from Doris Day. Doris Day had only one fixed planet, and it was only Neptune. This horoscope has 6 fixed planets, and the ascendant and the midheaven is also fixed. We're talking about a really fixed determination. And this isolated pattern is right at the heart of it, because it is Sun and square Moon from fixed signs. So this is about self-knowledge and self-revelation. She's trying to solve herself. Now, she has about a half a dozen best-selling books. And the interesting thing is that all of her books are in the first person, talking about herself. I think her first book was 10 things that I didn't learn in my education that I learned in life, and those kinds of books that she writes, or she's writing about herself or her experiential view of what she's gotten out of life. That's most of it. She's a television reporter, and when she's back to being a television reporter again, because after she quit when Arnold was governor, and she quit because she thought she would have a conflict of influence. So she quit during that period, and now she's back to doing it again. But when she does it, it's at the wish of the networks. I think she's with NBC, isn't she?
Used to be anyhow.
The View. Wasn't she on The View? I think that's what she was on. But it was always centered on her because she's a celebrity, and it's going to sell better that way. So she's boxed in. The square is a box, and she's boxed in, and she can't get out of that square. It's interesting in that she's been played 2 movie roles, at least at my biographical information, maybe more by now. But the 2 movie roles she played, you know who she played? Maria Shriver. You see what I mean? She can't get out of herself. And the only way that she can is through activity. And so what she does to get out of herself and to be more concerned with other people is she throws herself with all kinds of energy, all kinds of celebrity support to service work. To service work for people who are handicapped of one type or another. Some of the service work she does had me shaking my head because I don't understand it. She got government to employ people with mental disabilities. Yes, the state of California, and I think probably even through the Disabilities Act with Congress.
That sounds like a Democrat.
What?
That sounds like a Democrat.
Yeah, but
You mean she made them hire people who were mentally handicapped?
yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought that's what you meant.
Before her husband, and so
Interesting, in the last election, she supported Obama and he supported, what's his name, Romney.
Where is it that she's famous? Because she doesn't have anything over on in the first house or the
Yeah,
10th house.
I didn't look into that. I suppose I could. There's a pretty strong trine between Uranus and Venus, you would expect.
She was
Venus.
born into fame and then she married fame.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I didn't look that up. I'd have to do a special study to do that. I'm sorry that I haven't had that. All right. I'm forever fascinated by what people do.
She had like a million kids.
What?
Did she have a lot of kids?
Yes. 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 And they're all, a lot of them are raised by nannies, and not by herself. And one of the nannies is the one that messed with Arnold, a live-in nanny. And the kid was 7 years old before it was discovered, and he looked a lot like Arnold's. All right. Oops, daisy here. All right. Please, no Beatlemania. Heidi, don't you dare scream. I'm not anti-Beatle at all. I think they wrote some really nice songs, and I think they all had a great deal of talent, but the mania about them I could never understand. If I were writing beautiful music, I wouldn't want people to be screaming. That's such an ugly... What?
They didn't like it, but their promoters made a lot of money off of it.
Okay.
He is the one who...
When I looked at this horoscope and thought about Beatlemania, do you realize that they were in their glory 50 years ago?
Yes.
Wow, where did it all go? All right, there's a lot of genius in this horoscope. We have Saturn conjoined Uranus. And Saturn conjoined Uranus. Uranus is a planet of creative genius. The sextile Mars conjoined Pluto, which is more of the same, and the ability to hold on to it long enough. And then it trines Neptune in the first house, and so we have a double sextile producing a trine. That's a lot of creativity. It isn't all pleasantness, though, because the Sun and Jupiter square to Neptune. So there is, every rose has its thorn. I don't know how to say it any other way. What we're interested in is none of this. We're interested in Venus square the moon and Mercury sextile the moon. This is a pretty clean, pretty isolated pattern. And it's isolated from everything else, which is in that great big pattern. So this is like something like a side game compared to the big goal. This is a case where we have C1. Mercury is in the C1 position. If it were over here in Cancer, it would be in the C2 position, and then it would be sextile to the Venus. So this complex, or not complex, this compound pattern is unusual in that it's all with personal planets. The inner planets are called personal planets. Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon are considered personal. So this whole pattern is with personal planets. In the major pattern, the genius pattern, the Sun is the only one that is in that. So the other pattern is mostly outer planets. And with mostly outer planets, it's almost as if he is some kind of archetypal person and not himself. You know what I'm trying to say? That the that the generation or the things that are generational qualities that are ruled by Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, at least all of Jupiter probably in there too, all of them, his selfhood is tied up with that. So he's a man of the times as much as he is a man who makes the times. Now, it's not meant to be an insult. Doesn't mean he doesn't have any abilities. The genius is still there, but it's more that the genius is carried on by the times. He certainly does have talent and creativity, probably not near as much as Bob Dylan, who was of that same generation, but he has it. Looking at the chart, everything but Neptune is elevated, highly elevated, and that reinforces that. That means he's meant to be out in the world before the eyes of the world. Now, there is a large number of planets in Gemini reminiscent of what we saw in the Cole-Porter chart. Neither of them is especially deep, but Cole-Porter seems a little more so in what he does. Cole-Porter had all kinds of wit, but his music was more bouncy. Whereas, like when you listen to songs by Paul McCartney, they have a melodic quality to them, but they're not bouncy, and they have those long lines, lyrical lines to them. Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away, and you know what I mean? They just carry on like they're not real bouncy, is what I'm trying to get to. There is some smoothness, and the smoothness is due to the moon square Venus. What we're trying to get at here is that moon square Venus in a male's chart often indicates a misunderstanding of women. And I suspect that is true of him. It's hard to be understanding if you're made an idol of and women are throwing themselves at you. Now, he had a very good marriage with Linda that lasted 28 years. So he wasn't, 29 years, I think, 28 or 29. So it wasn't a complete bad luck as far as women were concerned, though he did lose her to cancer. But he went along, well, she was vegetarian, and he went along with all of her ideas. Remember in the grocery store, you used to be able to find Linda McCartney foods? And if you look at them compared to, on the same shelves, the other things that are there, she produced some pretty classy vegetarian frozen food, I thought. Much better than what you see on the shelves now. You see the Amy stuff is okay, but it wasn't the good quality that Lynn McCartney had. So at any rate, I think because he loved her, he went along with things. But since then, after he married, what was her name? I got it in the notes here somewhere. Heather Mills, who was eye candy. He didn't understand her at all, and she took him for a lot of money. And there were a lot of harsh words, perfectly typical. Now, his ability, the same as Cole-Porter, his ability to write, he would be taken by a woman and he was fluent in writing, whether he understood her or not. He was writing on his own feelings, and his own feelings had misunderstanding in them. So you have to consider that his writing was relief from the emotional jumble that he went through in having these relationships with women that weren't necessarily good. I don't know what his current wife is. Does anybody know anything about his current wife? What?
He was just in Grammys, so he's still healthy. He married the gal with one leg.
Yes. Okay.
Is that Heather? Or is that another one?
That was Heather, I think.
That was Heather.
Okay. But that's been something. He got over that.
Okay, but he's married right now. He's been married.
I don't know.
He's been married about 5 or 6 years now.
He's very vital and healthy.
Okay.
Why, he's got Neptune in the first house, and doesn't that usually indicate sort of a strangeness, which he isn't, you know, kind of a,
It's a sensitivity. If you asked me about the first house, I wasn't going to mention it. I would say that he buggered up his self-consciousness with drugs, because the sun is square to Neptune, and if he didn't already, if his self-consciousness wasn't already strongly influenced by star mania, people treating you crazy, it's hard to understand yourself and what you are if people are doing all
Well, he
these.
only went on 4 trips.
Yeah. Was he the one that got busted? He got just. Was it he or John that got busted in Japan? I think.
They were picking on John for no, you know, I mean, that had nothing to do with drugs. It had everything to do with the CIA and the FBI.
but he did get arrested for marijuana or
Yeah, he did, and I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. I think it's not a clear understanding of self. Is he weird? Maybe more. In England, they call it eccentric.
Well, he told his children were embarrassed when he got arrested in Ireland for pot, and he said, well, I don't drink. That was his
Yeah,
response.
yeah. Okay. Sorry, I don't have a final answer on that. One thing I find interesting is that when the lyrics were flowing, and those long lyrics, Mercury's retrograde. What is his most famous song? Yesterday. He's thinking about the past, and it's all bound up in that. I'm not positive that's astrological proof of his chart, but it sure makes sense to me.
He hated Yoko Ono.
What's that?
He hated Yoko Ono.
Oh, he did?
well, it seems like
Well, she was too much for almost anybody.
Too much for everyone.
But partnership has been very important in his life. Partnership with John, partnership with Linda.
Yeah, yeah.
Did he write Let It Be?
I'm not sure, really. Probably not. It's
Co-wrote
probably
it.
John.
All right. Everybody knows who Amelia Earhart was, right?
They just found her plane.
She was
No, for the
probably the most famous aviatrix ever, until what's her name went up and blew up in the Columbia. But pattern that we're looking at is the Sun conjoined Pluto, which is sextile to Mercury and square to Mars conjoined Jupiter. This is a little bit good isolation, except for the fact that the Moon and Pluto are in this revolving conjunction that revolves all the way out to Neptune, even though there's no orb between Moon and Venus and between Moon and Neptune. So it's, in some ways it's very good, in some ways it's not. It's hard to tell. Outside of the pattern, there's not much aspectation. You have Uranus conjoined Saturn, and that's about it. You have Sun is basically unaspected. It's even out of range to a trine to the pattern here. And having the Sun unaspected is one of the most difficult things to have. It's hard to engage yourself with the world. It's hard to engage yourself with your own talents because you have no leverage with them. And on top of that, the Sun is in, she might be on call. The Sun is in the 4th house, which is very subjective, and it's in the 2nd sign in the 4th house. So there's a lot of subjectivity about her, and it's a solitary life, and there's a certain amount of loneliness. Her father was an alcoholic, and he left the family, and fourth house is identification with the father. Emergency call, or what?
He thought I called him.
Oh, okay.
He was calling me.
So having the sun aspect in the fourth house means it's not really good understanding that comes in terms of the father related to him. And the mother was capable of bringing her up. And so she was ferried off to maternal grandparents. And this is interesting for distribution. In her chart, the mother's the 10th house, as we've said before. The mother's mother would be the 10th house from the 4th house, which would be the 7th house, which is in Saturn, which describes very much the way she was brought up by her grandparents. In some ways, it was strict and conventional. In other ways, it was free and unconventional. If you're interested in distributing charts in that way, this is a very almost good book example. Liberal, old-fashioned at the same time. Now, she was a social worker. She did a lot of work with children. She indulged herself in children and would go overboard doing things for children. But she decided that it was better to have a profession. And so she went to med school at Columbia. But she never became a physician. Saturn seems to deny, and if you're going to have a profession or not have a profession, it's involved. Saturn says yay or no. And people have professions that they're forced to do it because Saturn is in the 10th house. And some, no matter how hard they try, they can never have it. In her case, a friend took her flying when she was in med school, and she was immediately obsessed. We have all these planets in Aries signs, which is often common in Aries signs. One of my friends who I've just been working with astrologically has a son that is a pilot. And you know what he does on his days off? Goes flying. So when they get that when they get the flying mania, they're hooked on it. You just can't get away from it. And her obsession was with flying. She immediately dropped out of school and moved to California, sold everything she had, and tried to get up as much money as she could to buy a plane. And then she took off and did that. You know, that didn't mean off in that way. So what we have then is somebody that the square part is not only did she like flying, that she liked the freedom of it, the flow. Here we again have a great flow of Mercury and the moon, but she got into competition. And so the square comes out as competition. All of her freedom and the money that she gave and the status that she got for being a pilot, she wrote books, and they sold well, and they paid well, but it was the competitive flying, and with the obsessive quality of the moon and Pluto, it was competitive endurance flying, which you would normally associate with a fixed sign, but with her it was the obsessive quality that did it. But she could never, ever be satisfied. And it was when she was trying to be the first person to fly around the world at the equator that she had all of her problems. All right. Yes?
With the square, which is going to be more predominant there, Jupiter or Mars?
They're so close.
Doesn't make any difference?
They're so close it doesn't make it. They're only 8 minutes apart. The strongest part is the competitive. The whole pattern, the strongest part is the square of the moon to the Mars Jupiter, but they're so close in orb that it's so. All right. I get to say his name which always amuses me. All right, this is the horoscope of Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus from Hohenheim, who named himself Paracelsus, which means beyond Celsus, who was a famous classical physician. Humility wasn't one of his strong points. No, that Bombastus is his name.
I know.
The Bombastus from Hohenheim, the family, I think it's there to this day. And if I'm not mistaken, though I'm not absolutely certain, the land that he owned in Switzerland, which he never lived at really, is now owned by the Anthroposophical Society. I think it's Rudolf Steiner headquarters. I'm not certain of that, but I can't. But I've read that somewhere. He's probably he was famous in his own time as a healer, because he could heal people that nobody else could heal. He subsequently became famous for his chemical discoveries, which to this day science still loves, but they don't like his theories and ideas. Everybody else does. Rudolf Steiner was greatly indebted to him. Max Heindel is super indebted to him because his cosmological explanation of why astrology works is taken straight from Paracelsus. And Jakob Böhme, who had great inspiration and all kinds of experiences in the spiritual worlds, had no words to put them in, and he was deeply indebted to Paracelsus for it. He was deeply loved, and he was deeply hated. And the hate business is where all of this comes in. What we're looking at is the Sun conjoined Moon, are sextile to Uranus, and they are square to Saturn. By intervals, the Sun is the first planet, and Saturn is the last. If you go by degree sequence, Saturn is the first planet, and Uranus is the last planet. And it works out that way. The way the pattern works out is he was a person who believed in first-hand learning, first-hand knowledge. He's famous for his observations. Planets up here, there's a sextile between these planets. And there's a trine between Jupiter and Mars. So Mars is in a first house. It's a do-it-yourselfer. It is first-hand experience, learning by doing. With everything in Scorpio, he is a natural-born occultist. And with Jupiter in the 8th house, he's very successful. Just about everybody since him thinks he's the greatest that has been around. Now, the Sun and Moon squared to Saturn shows that he, being a man of first-hand experience, he doesn't trust tradition. And because he didn't trust tradition, and he was extremely outspoken about it, he lost a judgment on somebody who refused to pay him for work that he had done in healing. And when he lost the judgment, he told the whole court what he thought of the court. And it was shortly thereafter that he died. He died by falling off a cliff. What? Yes, they thought he was pushed off the cliff. You're familiar with some of his life.
They were gunning for him.
What?
They were gunning for him.
Okay. All right. So he had issues with tradition and with history, which he thought was not right, that you like find out for yourself. And since most of the tradition of his time was Aristotelian. He did not like Aristotle. And the medicine of his time came from Galen, which was also a tradition going all the way back to Rome, and he didn't trust Galen. So the way it worked out was he hung out with the Neoplatonists in the school of the Medici. And there he loved Pythagoras, loved Plato, and loved even Finicus, who was the resident Neoplatonist. But what happened is he would be disgruntled because he would try the old tried ways, supposedly tried and true ways, and he'd find them wanting. But he would have firsthand experience, and he would discover. So all of his life, it was a matter of fighting tradition, fighting things that were old hat, and making new discoveries. And when he made new discoveries, he was open and out about them, and had success after success, but he was not loved because he was too much outspoken and earned nothing but hatred from people.
What indicates the tradition?
Saturn.
Where it's located, or?
The aspectation, sun. The tradition is Capricorn is rising. There's certainly tradition in that, but the Saturn square, Saturn square the sun shows the hatred that he had toward it and the hatred he received from it. He was famous, and other people were obviously jealous. But Scorpio has enough jealousy of its own, and he probably rubbed it in their faces. All right. Another one that you have to, this is the last horoscope we have. This is the horoscope of Carl Sandburg. I didn't put the horoscope up there. Everybody knows who Carl Sandburg is, I hope. What we are looking at here is the clearest cut compound pattern, but it is a complete compound pattern, meaning to say Jupiter and the Sun sextile Saturn, Jupiter and the Sun square Mars. But coming back so that C1 is filled up as well as C2, Mars sextiles the Uranus. So we have two compound patterns here, and it doesn't make any difference by the degree sequences because there's only 44 degrees from the lowest degree in the pattern to the highest degree in the pattern, so that when one is hit, it's going to be simultaneous almost all the time. So you have to look at the interval sequences, and the interval sequences are the Sun and Jupiter sextile to Saturn, and the square comes later. And the second sextile kicks in, and it finds its hinge in the Mars also. This is fascinating how clear this horoscope works. And this pattern is basically about the whole of the horoscope. Nothing else really has a lot of influence. So, the Sun in Jupiter in Capricorn, even having Venus there, shows a person of great tradition, great history. Carl Sandburg is famous for two things. One is his 4-volume set of books on Abraham Lincoln and the history of his times. He won a Pulitzer Prize for being a historian, a historical writer. The year after he won the Pulitzer Prize for history, he won it for poetry, and he was considered a poet of the people. So, Sun, Mars, sextile Saturn shows the history. Very enthused in history. But then the war comes along, and the Sun, Jupiter square to Mars shows conflict in war. Now, he was a socialist. The moon and is in Aquarius, and it's sextile to Mars. So he was a socialist activist. And when he wrote his poems, he wrote them as socialist activity. And then the war came along, the Second World War. And when the Second World War came along, it waked up his tradition in the sense of patriotism. So what happened is, for all of his life, he was a socialist, and then he renounces socialism, and he joins the army to fight patriotically. And after the war is over, he stays with his renunciation of socialism, which seemed to him, when he was a socialist, he was really strong about it. His wife was even a socialist. His wife was the wife of Stieglitz, the famous photographer. And so he renounces it all out of conflict about the tradition of it. And it was, to me, it was a disgrace. Not that I'm a socialist, but to proclaim something so much in your life and then to renounce it and to do just the opposite thing. I can literally saw this with my own eyes in the 50s after the war was over. His most famous poem is called Chicago. I'm sure you've all read it in high school or something like that. Yeah, all of you familiar with Chicago? The opening line is Chicago, hog butcher of the world. And he goes on, talking about the common man working in Chicago, and it's meant to be socialistic. But in 1950s, after the war is over, he reads Chicago, hog butcher of the world, and he uses it as a segue to sell real estate. I saw it with my own eyes. I was a beatnik at the time, and I was outraged that somebody would sell out that much. But it's a neat pattern. It shows the whole complexity of it. He really was an activist, and he acted on what he believed in, and he got emotionally roused up by it. And he really was a traditionalist, and he wrote a very good history, a good quality writing, good quality information. But eventually the two clashed with each other, and they clashed with each other when there was a war, and the outcome seems to be more in favor of the squares than it does of any of the sextiles, even though C1 and C2 are both occupied. It's a life worth study, and it's astrologically very interesting in terms of the compound. All right, next time we will look at case threes. That is that is a trine being external to a square. What we're looking at next time. So if you look at your own horoscopes and you see in your pack of horoscopes that you've got someone that has those qualities in, maybe you'll get a little bit of insight into it next time. Yes?
I would like you to go back to the very first
Horoscope?
horoscope. Yep.
Okay, Doris Day.
Doris Day. Yep.
Okay. Oops. All right. Oops. Upside down. Okay.
All right. Now, you said the square that we were talking about.
The square was Moon square Mercury, in that Mercury is in fall and in detriment in Pisces, and it is not a mind that is boggled, it is a mind that is easily befuddled. And emotionally, I think she was befuddled in trying to find a father, didn't have a father, so to speak. The seventh house, where she chose her partners, is the sun opposite Jupiter, even though there's a grand trine there, the sun opposite Jupiter, is when it came to marriage, she became overly optimistic. And in her over-optimism, she chose bad people. And some of the first husband even beat her.
Okay, so, but the other part of that is the Venus.
The Venus, she's
Okay.
a woman's woman.
Okay.
And she knew how to be, even if she perhaps maybe did have the tomboy role, she knew how to play or be the woman's woman, which she did. All of her movies are like that. And as Bonnie gave us the key information there, that she was chastised for it by the women's movement because she was too much girly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not because she was too much girly, but because she would play somebody who was weak, like she would be.
Yeah.
I remember one movie she was on, Pills for Anxiety. She was hysterical. Or Rock Hudson would spank her for being disobedient, or things that were really offensive.
But when Rock Hudson did it, he was warming up for later in the night.
Yeah, it was. That's right. Oh, Mommy.
She probably tied him up and beat him at night.
Okay.
Okay, that's good.
She played the 1950s stereotype of a woman.
Yeah.